Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and recently I published a talk about how to avoid the distractions of modern society, which was intended for Catholic parents and for children or just Catholic adults in general. And as a follow-up to that video, a parent wrote to me with a question that I'd like to take up and talk about a little bit and invite you to think about and talk about with me. So again, the video was titled How to Avoid Distractions in Modern Society, and you can check that video out if you're interested. And this mother, who I'm not going to name, but she wrote, "I just listened to the video about distractions and how to live as a Catholic first in the world." And then she asked this question as a parent: how can we deal with distractions and influences that our children receive from the world around them? How can we deal with distractions and influences that our children receive from the world around them? And this is a great question. And if you're a parent, you know what a source of stress and uncertainty this issue brings into your life. So it's one thing to start our family and welcome children into our family, and then to set up our home so that we can provide our children with the best influences possible, to try to be the best examples that we can for our children. But then we start to realize that we face this other dilemma. And this other dilemma is, I'm not the only influence on these children. My wife's not the only influence on these children. These children are going to be influenced by many other people. And this makes the work of parenting much more complicated and challenging. And so we have this wrestling match to enter into where we've got to navigate this very confusing responsibility of raising these children where we're not the only influence in their lives. And the influences are not all in our control, and they can be terrible. And what do we do about this? How do we handle this? How are we possibly supposed to manage all of these external influences successfully? What in the world are we supposed to do? And then she goes on to provide a specific example with regard to video games. She says, for example, my son loves to play this video game called Minecraft. My son is obsessed with Minecraft because his older cousins play it. And so you've got these family relations. The older cousins are doing things. They talk about it. Our kids find out about it. They're interested in it. They want to do it. And now we've got this dilemma. What do we do about this? Now, what you'll find most Christians do is they try to establish some kind of absolute moral rule. They try to establish some kind of moral ideal. And you'll hear Christians talking about this all the time. You'll hear Christians criticizing the modern world and saying things like, I believe in absolute truth. And so they'll try to establish and enforce some absolute rule as parents, and they'll think that doing this is faithful and righteous and wise, and fighting about this absolute rule will be, considered their duty as parents. And again, that sounds like a good thing. I mean, shouldn't we fight for absolute truth? Shouldn't we fight for absolute moral right versus wrong. It sounds good, but it's actually a little bit too simplistic for the actual challenge that we face, and our experience proves to us that it really doesn't address the problem. The problem's more complicated, more subtle than that. And the work of parents is more challenging than that. Now, if you are a Catholic parent and you'd like to know what I'd recommend for you to study, the book or the course that I'd recommend for you to study is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we just call this classical ethics. But that's the book that teaches the whole science of moral philosophy, of ethics. And, these Christians who talk about absolute truths might expect to go to this master text on moral philosophy and find all of these moral truths, or absolute truths explained, since this is a book on ethics. And yet, when we open up and study Aristotle's Ethics, we find that's not what he does at all. He teaches that ethics don't work like that. You've probably heard of the phrase, the golden mean. Now, the golden mean is the middle place between two opposite vices. And that middle place, and we're not talking about middle with regard to distance between 2 points, because we're talking about vices, not places. So don't think geometrical middle. This is a moral middle between two opposite vices. And that middle, that moral middle, is called the golden mean. That's where virtue is. It's in that middle. So, for example, if we had two vices, one where a man was wasteful, where he threw away money and was careless, the prodigal, that would be one extreme vice. He's wasteful. But then on the opposite extreme, we have a man who's stingy and who isn't as generous as he should be. He actually keeps too much. He doesn't give enough. So we've got that vice, the stinginess, on the one side, and then we've got the wastefulness on the other side. And somewhere in between those two vices, again, not some idea of the, geometrical middle between them, but somewhere in between those two extreme vices, we find the golden mean, where virtue is found, the balance between those two opposite vices. That's where we find virtue. Now, when we talk about absolute truth, and we have this idea, the idea is that somewhere between them there is a middle, and it's the same for everyone. And that's not true. The same middle is not true for everyone. It's relative. And we have to be careful when we hear things like relativism, moral relativism, and everyone screams about it and goes crazy saying moral relativism is false and we believe in absolute truth. We have to be careful that we ourselves don't go too far and actually fall off the other side of the horse, as Erasmus used to say. The problem with relativism is that it's kind of true. But the real principle of relativism is that man is the measure of all things, and that's where it errs. Relativism as an idea is true. There are definitely things that are relatively good and bad. Something may be good for you that's not good for me. Something may be bad for me that's not necessarily bad for you. There is a relativism in real life. Jesus teaches relativism. He says, "To whom much is given, much is expected. To whom less is given, less is expected." Well, that's relativism. There's not an absolute rule. It's relative. there is relative morality. The problem when we talk about relativism, we're talking about a man-made idea or standard of what's right and wrong, when men can simply change it however they please, that man is actually the judge of what's right and wrong, and that right and wrong is established by convention or by agreement among men. We see this in America, in democracy, where the people vote to decide what's legal and illegal. That's moral relativism. But there is a true relativism that's different from that false human relativism, worldly relativism. True relativism is influenced by divine revelation, by a knowledge of the end for which human beings exist. God himself gives us commands. God himself teaches us. But even God's commands have to be interpreted in different circumstances with some flexibility, because things are not always the same. And while some may bristle at this, it's really common sense. For example, we have a difference between murder and manslaughter in our legal system. If a person backs out of a driveway and accidentally hits a child and the child dies, the person driving is not a murderer. We understand that there's relative circumstances in moral matters, and this is just common sense. Some will object to it to try to sound smart, but this relative nature of moral issues is true. It's just that it's also influenced by God's commandments, by God's will. So it's not the same as a human relativism. It's a religious, divinely inspired relativism. And I don't want to get too philosophical because we don't need to. But anyway, when we read moral philosophy, we learn that there's a golden mean between two extreme vices. So when we look at moral issues in our families, we're going to find that the circumstances are different from one family to another. We're going to find that the circumstances are different between one child and another. And so that mean between the two vices is not going to be in the same place for every person. And I'll give you an example. My wife and I are the perfect combination because our strengths and weaknesses are the opposites, and we complement each other perfectly. For example, right now it's 1:15 in the morning. I'm wide awake. My wife's in bed. My wife at times struggles with wanting to sleep or with sloth. She doesn't struggle with it much at this point in our life, but when we were first married, she struggled with the vice of sloth. And she had to learn to be more active and get herself up and going and work and be tougher with resisting a desire to sleep, to get things done. So she struggled with sloth. And yet, in terms of eating, my wife is the most temperate woman. Very temperate. Eats healthy, eats what she needs, really has no interest in eating extra food, and so on. That's my wife. Strong in one area, weak in another area. I'm the opposite of her. I would live without sleep if I could. I have no interest in sleeping. I don't like to go to bed. When I wake up, I feel worse than when I went to sleep. I really don't like sleep. I love my work, and I see sleep as an interruption of my enjoyment of my work. I sleep as little as possible. I'm sort of the opposite of my wife with regard to sleep. But when it comes to food, I was raised in a house that ate constantly. I love to eat. And so my wife and I, like I said, are opposites. I have to be careful with eating. My wife has to be careful with sleeping. I don't have to think twice about sleeping too much. My wife doesn't think twice about eating too much. We're different. We're opposite. Now, when it comes to the golden mean with regard to eating, the golden mean in my life for eating is not in the same place as the golden mean in my wife's life with regard to eating. And the golden mean for me with sleeping is not in the same place as it is for my wife. And so you can see how that golden mean will need to be adjusted based upon our individual strengths and weaknesses. So these things can't be judged absolutely, but we have to know the details of circumstances and judge them circumstantially. They have to be judged individually based on the details of the different people and circumstances. Now, when we come to things like these parenting questions, this is why it's more complicated. We can't make an absolute rule. You can make an absolute rule, but you may find that the rule causes more damage than it removes. You can fight with your children all the time about certain issues, and actually those fights can produce more harm than the thing you were fighting about would have ever produced had you just left it alone. So these things get complicated. Even with our different individual children, you'll see their personalities are different. And just as my wife and I have different strengths and weaknesses, our individual children will have different strengths and weaknesses. And so the idea of this absolute truth sounds like a nice idea, but that's actually a cop-out of the real work that we have to do as parents, because everything is circumstantial. So we've got differences in the personalities, in the strengths and weaknesses of our children. That's one source of complexity. But then there are more that come in over time. For example, if you're a parent and you've got, let's say, 2 young children, ages 5 and 3, managing those children is quite simple and easy. You can easily control their daily schedule. You can easily control all of the influences in their life. You can control what they eat, what they drink, when they sleep, when they play, what they play, how they play. You can control almost every aspect of their lives when they're young children. And the house is quiet and there's just a few kids. They're to bed by 9 o'clock at night. The house is quiet in the evening. It's very simple to manage 1 or 2 or 3 young children. When those children get older and now they enter into their teens and you have more children coming in who are now the young children, well, now you've got a totally different situation. Now you've got teenage children who are much more difficult to manage than the toddlers were. And you've still got toddlers, and yet those toddlers don't live in the same circumstances that the first set of children lived in when they were toddlers. So the whole environment of your home, the circumstances of your family life have changed. And things get more complicated. Then you have some children become adult children. Let's say they go to college. Well, now they're away from home in the presence of other influences, and they come home as adults in between semesters or whatever. And so you've got an adult child in the house. You've got some younger teenage children in the house, and you've got some younger children in the house. Let's say toddlers still. You know, my children, just for reference, my oldest is 22. I've got a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old. So 3 age 19 and above. And then I've got an 18-year-old, and then from age 16 down to 8. So a bunch of kids, 10 kids, from an 8-year-old up to a 22-year-old. And they're all home at some point. And so all of these different influences and all of this complexity in the family, which when my children were young didn't exist. So that's another kind or another source of complexity that we have to deal with in parenting. So it's to have this, absolute truth idea, like I said, sounds nice, allows somebody to talk a good story, but when you actually get into the complexity and the constantly changing circumstances of family life, as the family grows and the kids grow up and you face all these new issues, the environment and circumstances of each kid is different than the other kids. Everything is different. We're different. When my oldest son was 5 years old, that was 17 years ago. I was 30 years old. I'm now 47 raising an 8-year-old. That 8-year-old has a totally different set of parents than our older children had. The work we were doing, the time we spent doing things, financial resources, all of these different variables are present in the family. And it makes parenting very complicated. So these questions really have to be investigated. And I'll say one thing that I learned from experience is that when a couple gets married and they start their family, it's very important that they get to work on this from the beginning, because as the family becomes more and more complicated, it's manageable if you're focused on these things from the beginning and you parent along the way, and your parenting becomes more and more complex as your family becomes more and more complex. So you have time. You have time to learn and develop and adjust and make changes as your family goes through this growth and complexity. You have time if you're working on it all along the way. But if you leave it to run out of control and then try to get things under control later, and you're 42 years old with a very complex household, and yet you've got the moral understanding or the parenting understanding of a 28-year-old parent, you're going to have a very difficult time. And so it's important to commit to this from the beginning. Now, that's not to shame anyone who hasn't done that, because all we're responsible for is the best that we can do. But that's simply a word of warning to younger couples, that you really need to get on top of things and get things in order and start learning about these issues so you can manage parenting as it grows more and more complex. And thankfully, when I was a young parent, I had a pastor. I was still a Protestant at the time. I had a pastor, and any time that he talked to me about practical things, about parenting and family life, he used to get in my face, look me in the eyes, and say, "Bill, it's just going to get busier. It's just going to get busier." And he used to tell me that all the time, because he saw my life, he saw what the work that I was doing and things, and he used to tell me, it's just going to get busier. It's not going to get easier. It's not going to get simpler. It's going to get busier and busier. And so I was thankfully warned about that early on, and I knew to take it seriously and get to work on it. So let's start getting to the real point here. But I want you to have that principle in mind, that we have these opposite vices, and we want to find the golden mean between these vices to make good moral decisions as parents. And we'll focus on this specific topic of video games because it's a common one. My older children, when they were young, no TV, hardly any video watching, anything. Certainly no video games in the house, but that's because we had a small number of children with parents who were present for them all the time. I was teaching in a private school. My schedule was very light. I had lots of time home. My wife was a stay-at-home homeschooling mother who was focused on our few kids. Life was very, very simple. It was very easy managing the children. Our family culture was beautiful. We had everything under control because life was simple. It was easy. As time went on, family life got more expensive. Kids grew up. Other kids were born. Family life got more complicated. My life got busier. My expenses went up. My work increased in difficulty and time and things like that. My wife often had to help me with things, helping me with my work. our attention was now divided between more children, and our children grew and sort of manifested their own personalities and their own strengths and weaknesses. And so in our home, new weaknesses were introduced. Just as my wife and I have weaknesses, well, our children also revealed that they too have unique weaknesses. And so more weaknesses were introduced, and also strengths were introduced. But now there are more weaknesses in the household, and all of a sudden we have someone who struggles with a thing that my wife and I don't struggle with. And so now there's a new problem in the house, and in the next kid there's a different problem in the house, and all of a sudden the house has more problems. The moral condition of the house changes, becomes more complex, in some ways becomes worse, and the challenge of parenting increases. One of the questions we have to ask is, what are the extreme evils that we need to guard against? What are the extreme evils? And where is the golden mean between these things? So let's take something like video games. Tonight, after I received this question, I was sitting with my kids at the dinner table, and I asked them. I told them that a mother had written to me and asked about video games, and I wanted to ask them a few questions. And so I asked them, why do you like video games? What is it about video games that you like? And so my son Jacob, who's 15, said, it's just relaxing. It's just, you can just kind of relax and play the game, and it's a nice way to relax. And so I asked him, so if you had to choose between, let's say, going to the gym or playing video games, which would you choose? And he said, I'd choose to go to the gym. And I said, if you had a choice to I asked one of my other sons, if you had a choice to go to wrestling practice or play video games, what would you rather do? He said, I'd rather go to wrestling practice. And so the consensus among the kids was that video games are enjoyable because they're just relaxing. There's no pressure, nothing to worry about. You can just sit down, relax, and just sort of idle some time away. It's just a pastime. It's a recreational activity. There's nothing more to it than that. And I think they answered that honestly, that it's just something they like to do when there's nothing else to do. And if there are other things to do, well, yeah, then they'd rather do those things. But there aren't always things to do. And so you get some idle time, a few hours where you don't really have much to do, and it's fun to play Minecraft. Or my kids are more military minded. They say their favorite game is Call of Duty. And they just like to, so quote unquote, chill out and play video games for a little while together, or you can compete against other people. So that's what they're interested. That's what they say interests them in video games. And I think it points out the real issue. It's just an idle pastime. That's really what it is. And you can pick your different idle pastimes, and you can set up your own preference. You can say, well, watching cartoons for a little while is okay, but I don't like video games. But you've got to realize that that's just arbitrary, right? You can go sit under a tree with, a Dr. Seuss book, and you can go sit under the tree idle and pass the time reading a Dr. Seuss book. You can judge that to be okay, but playing a video game for some reason you judge to not be okay. You can say, well, you can go outside and shoot baskets for a little while or ride your bike for a little while, and that's an idle pastime. That's okay, but video games for some reason is not okay. And so to the kids it appears like it's just arbitrary, like for some reason you don't want them to play video games, but it's okay if they do other idle things. If they play Candyland, that's okay for some reason. But the video game, for some reason, is bad. And so there's not a real developed moral principle guiding this judgment. And the kids can sense that. The kids can sense that. And they see that the rules seem to be arbitrary and, to put it plainly, stupid. And so that's going to lead to trouble. I've already mentioned my kids play video games. I don't think it's a big deal. I mean, obviously, there are video games that will have, unnecessary, immoral content in them, and we shouldn't be interested in things like that. But I understand it as a source of a pastime to just burn some idle time when as kids there's nothing else to do. I mean, I don't have any idle time. Idle time for me is when I sit down to eat dinner. Idle time for me would be when I go out to exercise. I mean, that's as idle as my time gets. Maybe if I watch a movie with my wife, that's my idle time. So as a 47-year-old man with 10 kids who owns a business and has all of these different things to do, all of which I love, I don't even seek any rest from them. I'm not interested in idle pastimes. I don't have any idle time to pass. And so it's an issue I don't have to deal with. But I'm 47 years old. I'm self-employed. I mean, I have a lot of stuff to do. So it's not because I'm more virtuous. It's not because I make better use of my idle time. It's that I simply don't have any idle time. Whereas to be a 12-year-old kid and, it be raining outside and mom's making dinner and you're waiting for dinner and you've already studied for 7 hours today and there's really nothing to do. You've got this time to pass and, who's going to judge which pastime is right and which pastime is wrong without any real moral principle behind it? So when I talked to my kids about it tonight, they said, well, watching television, you just sit there, you don't do anything. At least video games, you do something. At least there's stuff to do. It's better than watching TV. That's how they look at it. It's better than TV. TV, you just sit there. And I think I'd agree with them that it is better than TV. But again, I look at it as a pastime. And I really, I think it raises other issues and leads us to see that the problem actually is in other places. There's other things that are wrong. If we're getting upset that our kids are playing a video game, it's a sign that something else is wrong. And we're just taking out frustration on this video game because, we wish our kids would do better things than that. So, for example, in our family, our kids have school through the day with my wife, and they'll study from 10 o'clock in the morning until dinner time. So they've got a full day of studies, and my wife is working with them and supervising their studies. They put in a full day of studies. And my wife will allow them to play video games to kill time when there's just nothing to do at the moment. And my wife thinks it's a good thing. She actually likes when the kids play some video games as a break because, it's better than other things they could do. They could be doing other things that are worse. For example, if we said, hey, kids, go outside, the kids might grab their BB guns and get into mischief outside. Well, now we've got problems to deal with outside that we could have avoided by just letting the kids play some video games for a little while until dinner was ready. So there's just other things to consider. But if they have a full day of school and they get lots of, you obviously can't study from the moment you wake up until you go to bed. So we have to be realistic in what's expected of the kids. And if they put in a full day of studies, we can't harass the kids because they would like to just relax for a little while, and they find video games relaxing, and they play video games for a little bit. I think most parents who are frustrated with video games are not frustrated that their kids, after having completed a full day of studies, would like to rest for a little while and play some games together. I think they're frustrated because the kids are not getting their studies done. and are playing games instead. And that's a different matter because that's not idle pastime. And so you see how, if we think about it, it sort of reveals a different problem. The problem is not the video games. The problem is that one child in one situation is playing a video game to kill some idle time after having completed his work as he was supposed to. And another child is not participating in a responsible idle pastime, but is playing when he should be working, or is playing instead of working. And sometimes I think parents, homeschool parents, blame their frustration on the kids when it was their fault that they didn't have a full school day today. So I hope you can see that this starts to get more complicated, and the real issues start to be revealed if we reflect on it and think through the details. If our kids had a full day of studies and had some idle time, why would video games be a problem? They wouldn't be. So why would we be upset? Well, that's probably not the situation. So what is the situation? Well, I'm frustrated as a parent because the kids didn't do any studies. They didn't pay attention during their studies, and every time I turn around, they're on video games on their computers, or they're slipping away upstairs and they're playing video games while I do something else. Well, those are different issues. Those are different issues. And what we're going to see is that the parents have to evaluate their schedule. They have to evaluate what they actually provide their children to do, the time that it's provided, and so on. They have to consider whether or not they are the source of the problem. And this is a principle I think is important in parenting. Whenever there's a problem, to consider whether you're the cause of the problem before you start fussing about the kids. Our kids are usually pretty good. If we provide them with what they need and we order things rightly, they usually respond pretty well. And for example, take food. You know, kids who fuss about eating vegetables are usually kids who are given junk food at other times as if it's okay, and then they're given, you know, some Brussels sprouts and carrots, and they fuss, and the parents pretend like there's something wrong with the kid, but the kid's judging the Brussels sprouts relative to the junk food that they've been eating. And so the parents created that whole problem by spoiling the tastes of the kids. If the kids are given simple foods and kept on a simple diet, a temperate diet, they won't complain about those things. And that problem was actually caused by the parents, not by the kids. And the same thing can be true with something like video games. The kids can be left unsupervised, which is the parents' fault. And so now a kid is unsupervised for an hour or more, whatever, and you know, he's not going to sit there and continue memorizing the Latin grammar as long as it takes for mom to return and check on him. He's going to get bored, he's going to get distracted, he's going to start clicking around on other things, and he's going to end up goofing around a little bit because he's not being supervised, because the homeschool is not well ordered. The schedule is not well ordered. Mom's attention is not where it should be. Not if she wants to be strict about video games. So you can see that I think as parents, we have to start examining ourselves and our own work before we start talking about the kids, because I really don't think these things are the kids' fault in most cases. We have to make sure that we've eliminated all of the causes that are in our control. Because if we've eliminated all the causes that are in our control, well then we'll see our kids actually voluntarily choosing to do things that they shouldn't do, and we can address those issues. But you see, video games never become the actual issue. It's always something else. It's easy to, to yell at and stomp the video game. I saw one video where a father took his son's video game console and all the games, put them out in the backyard and ran them over with a lawnmower. You can do that, but you you haven't addressed the actual problem, because the video games were not the actual problem. The problem was, the kid being unsupervised, the kid having a poorly organized schedule, not having better things to do, not having other things provided, not having supervision from his parent. The other things are the problem, not the video games. So that's what I would always tell parents. That's what I tell myself. That's what I tell my wife. If my wife complains about something, I immediately start thinking about, well, what are we doing? What's the schedule? What are they supposed to do? Do they have everything they're supposed to have? Are you keeping an eye on them? Where are they? They're sitting in the other room with, well, that's not a good idea. Get them to sit back at the table and stay where you can see them and keep an eye on them. If you're not going to be with them, take all their computers away for a little while. Turn the Wi-Fi off. There's just so many different ways to control these things and eliminate the problems that are in our control. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is when the kids start to actually disobey. And then if they're disobeying and sneaking and doing bad, well, that's just disobedience. That's the problem, right? It's the commandment, obey your parents, that's being disobeyed. And again, the video games aren't the evil. And so I don't know why everyone directs their anger at the video games. The video games aren't doing anything wrong. There are other problems that parents should be thinking about as they consider these things. Stop blaming the video games, or Candyland isn't the cause of the problem. Just like television or any other natural thing that isn't intrinsically evil. The problem is caused by something else. Alcohol isn't evil. The abuse of alcohol, which is caused by other problems, becomes evil because of those other problems. And we need to remedy the actual causes of the problem. So the kids get into the video games. They're fun. They're intended to be entertaining. We're interested in them because they're just fun. It's idle pastime, relatively inexpensive. The parents, you can go out and get a game console for a couple $100. Games can be, $50? Kids can play them for a couple years. Relatively inexpensive. So you say, well, you could be doing better things. And the parent can be yelling at the kid saying, you could be doing better things. There's other things you could be doing instead of playing video games. And, my question to the parent is, like what? Like what? What could they be doing? Really, what could they be doing instead of playing video games? Are you sure that you've actually provided them with other things to do? Are the things that you've provided them with, are they realistic? For example, when I was a kid, if a friend was around, all we needed was a ball and a couple baseball gloves, and we'd just go out front and throw the ball around for hours. We'd invent games in all kinds of different situations. We'd play wiffle ball. We didn't need anything. You give us a Nerf football, and we'd go burn 2 hours throwing football around, playing tackle one-on-one or whatever, But we also played real organized sports, which was why we were interested in all the little activities like playing catch and pitching and wiffle ball. And we also played wiffle ball and all these different sports. And while we were doing these things, we were imitating all of the players and all of the plays that we learned in the hours that we spent watching sports on television. So it wasn't so innocent as, well, when I was a kid, we used to play outside. Yeah, you used to play outside imitating all of the stuff you watched on television. So it's not so innocent, not so simple. And our memory tends to be selective, as if everything we did was virtuous. I spent countless hours watching football, baseball, basketball, hockey, every sport I could find on television. Kept me out of a lot of worse things, because if you left me home alone with the television, I really wasn't interested in watching any bad stuff. I wanted to watch the sports. And then watching all the sports, you learn all the different players and their stances and their gestures and their movements and their all these different things. And then when you get a chance to go outside with your friends, you reproduce those plays you saw, you imitate your favorite players. That's all from television. So it's not that simple. And if you take, my Christian kids who don't watch sports, never have been interested in sports, don't watch sports on television, don't know the players and the plays and all the things, and you just hand them a bat and ball and some gloves, what are they supposed to do with that? It's not, the whole situation is different. And so you see, we're not being realistic in providing them with something to do. I went out to play basketball to imitate Michael Jordan or Larry Bird or whoever else I wanted to, shoot like or, play like. My kids don't even know those things because they're not interested in that stuff. Do we actually provide them with better things to do? My 8-year-old daughter dances in the local ballet. Nutcracker performances start tomorrow. She spends at least 2 nights a week at ballet practice at age 8. This past week, it's been a few nights for rehearsals and things like that. It's expensive. It's a financial commitment to allow her to do that, not just for the classes and the lessons, but for the supplies and the ballet shoes and the tap shoes and the leotards and all the different supplies that she needs and different things that come up. It's a significant financial commitment. For my sons to wrestle or go to the gym, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month to provide them with other things to do. So you see how if we're trying to save money and not spend anything and trying, we don't provide our kids with opportunities to do things, and then we get on their case that they're playing video games, and we say, you could be doing better things. You could be doing, like what? What other things? Really? What other things? Really? Not theoretically, not ideally. Really, what other things could they be doing? What other things have we provided for them to do? Things that they're actually interested in, not stuff that we were interested in. What are we really providing them to do that's better, that they could be doing? Should they study 24 hours a day? Of course not. You don't study 24 hours a day. I don't study 24 hours a day. We can't complain that they're not studying every waking hour. What else should they do? Pray constantly? Pray. They're kids. Do you pray constantly? I struggle to say my daily prayers every day. Should I expect my kids to be more devout than I am or more disciplined than I am? Of course not. I should expect them to do less than I, as an adult Catholic, would do. And so we should expect less of our kids than of ourselves. And if we're yelling at our kids about things we ourselves don't do, again, that's a different problem. That's just hypocrisy. We're picking on our kids and judging them unjustly, judging them according to some standard that we don't even keep ourselves to. And our kids see that. I'm not fooling anybody. So I think we have to ask seriously, if our kids are interested in playing video games, and we have this idea that they should be doing something better, well, what would that better thing be? What have we actually provided them to do that's actually better and of interest to them? They're not robots. What have we actually provided for them to do that's actually better and they're actually interested in? Let's be fair and realistic. It's hard to provide kids with things to do that they're interested in. My older daughters never had an interest in dance. My youngest daughter begged us to let her dance, and she dances 24 hours a day, figuratively speaking. That was her personality, her interest. My older sons were interested in hunting, fishing, camping, doing farm work. They were physical and active and outdoors. My younger kids, they're interested in sports. They're interested in exercise. They're interested in guns and, going outside and shooting and things like that. Different interests. Different interests require different equipment, different activities, different supplies? Are we providing them with better things to do? That's a real challenge for us because it's expensive. It's difficult. For example, if my sons want to wrestle, I don't have time to be their wrestling coach. I don't have time to teach them how to wrestle. I can work with them once in a while when I get a break, but I don't have time to teach them to wrestle and to train them and all these other things. I have to pay somebody to do that. Are we doing things like that and actually providing for them to have better things to do than play video games? If we're not providing for them to do better things, then what are we really complaining about? It's just not, we're not being fair to the kids. They really don't have anything better to do. And then there's another issue that comes up where parents, they get into this little house mentality where they would like the kids not to play video games, but they'd like them to do other things like read books or play with other toys and so on. And so the argument becomes, well, for some reason, playing with Legos is good, but playing a video game is bad. And the kids would like to know why that is. How have Legos been anointed as holy activity or a holy toy, and the video game has been anointed or has been condemned as an evil toy? How is that judgment made? What's the principle here? And, parents will get into wacky stuff like, oh, well, to play with Legos, you have to use your imagination and blah, blah, blah. It's just play. It's just toys. There's not some, profound intellectual development taking place when a kid plays with Legos. It's a pastime. It's idle time. It's play. It's not work time. It's not prayer. It's not worship. It's just idle time because kids have lots of idle time. There's lots of time that kids just spend waiting for something else to do. And so parents get into this mode where they approve, rather arbitrarily of one kind of activity and disapprove of another, and the kids look at that and they just see it as being arbitrary, and they really don't understand why that is. It's okay, like I said, to read Cat in the Hat, some goofy, useless book is okay, but to play a video game is not okay. To play with blocks and Matchbox cars is okay. To play a video game is not okay. To bounce a ball around is okay. Video game is not okay. It seems very arbitrary because it is very arbitrary. And so we have to evaluate the situation and ask ourselves, what are we actually providing our kids to do? What are we asking them to do? And is it reasonable? Is it reasonable? Now, to get back to this specific question and start wrapping this up here, when there are outside influences on our kids, the first question is, are we able to control these outside influences? And if it's our home and our children, we should be able to control these influences. But again, we're going to find that these other sources have influence usually because we're not doing other things we could be doing, or we're not doing better things, or we're simply idle. I remember one time my father had a habit of showing up in the middle of the morning, and he'd visit and come over because he's retired and he'd just be idle. And I used to get frustrated because, he'd come into the house and the kids would be goofing around, and then he would start talking to the kids and playing with the kids, and I didn't want the kids doing that at the time. But then I started to realize that my father visits and he comes in and the kids are idle. And so he goofs around with the kids a little bit because he sees that the kids are idle. And then he eventually leaves, and we act as if we're upset because the kids were goofing around, but they were idle. If my father walked in the house and the kids were all sitting in desks or at a table and mom was leading them through their studies, he wouldn't do that. He would realize that these kids are busy, they're studying, they're on a schedule, they're doing things, and he wouldn't even want to come over at those times. But it was our idleness creating the situation that actually invited the outside influence. And I think many times parents do things like that. A mother, for example, home with the kids during the day, may get bored, may wish she had social activity, may seek social activity, and her own desire for social activity leads to these unwanted external influences on the children. And so you can look at the kids and you can blame those other kids and, those rascals over there. But really, this whole entire problem, if we trace it back to where this comes from, we find mom wants to hang out with Mrs. Jones, and Mrs. Jones' kids are rascals, and they talk about all these things that they do, and they have this bad influence on these kids, and it's because of mom's desire for social time. And you may think that that's unfair, but don't complain. That's how it happens. That's how the things happen. And if you consider that social time, and this is being honest, if you consider that social time to be important, and it may be important, you may need that social time to just handle the daily grind of housewifery and parenting, because it gets lonely or it gets tedious and you just need a break for a little while. That little bit of social time may bring some negative consequences, but it may be necessary. I'm not judging that. I'm just saying you have to be honest that may be the cause of that other trouble. And so you see how it reveals other issues to be considered and thought about and possibly accommodated. Like maybe there's something that mom needs to do that's better than that. Instead of looking for some lazy social time with Mrs. Smith, maybe mom can find something better to do that gives her some relief, and she doesn't have to have that influence anymore. So I don't think that demonizing the video games or anything else, I'm just talking about video games because that was the example brought up here, but I don't think that demonizing the video games really addresses the problem. I think it's a cop-out from the real challenge that we face as parents, because like I just said, a lot of these problems, when we start backtracking and tracing them back to the source, we find that the source is us. We actually created that situation. I bought the television. I had the cable TV installed. I had the Wi-Fi installed. So we're often the causes of these things. And sometimes the evils, I'll put them in quotation, the evils that come into our family life because of things we do, sometimes they're inevitable. Sometimes they're inevitable, if we're honest. So as we go through this, I hope you see that we start to open up more and more issues. We start to open up more and more questions, more and more things to think about and evaluate in our family life, in our schedule, in our parenting, all of these different things. So it's not so simple as blaming the video games for everything, because the video games are coming in at the end of a long chain of events. And that whole chain needs to be traced back to its source. And then that source needs to be evaluated, because sometimes our kids, and I'm saying this carefully, sometimes our life puts our children into the presence of undesirable things, and they have to resist temptation. That doesn't mean, and I'm being careful because I know the doctrine, we should not enter into temptation willfully or carelessly. I understand that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting anything foolish like that. But what I'm saying is there are just situations in real life where our necessary work or our necessary activities bring us into contact with influences that we have to resist. And our children have to learn that they have to resist these influences. If we can eliminate them, we must. But sometimes we can't, and they have to resist those things. For example, let me compare it to when we dress the kids. Let's say it's cold outside, and so we'll buy the kids clothes and sweatshirts and scarves and hats and coats and boots and gloves, and we'll dress these kids as much as we can. But there's a certain point where, I tried to dress you as warmly as I can, but you know what? It's so cold out that you're going to have to be tough. You're going to have to bear with the cold. You're going to have to just deal with it. I can only reduce it so much. I can only keep you so warm. And at that point, you've got to add your own toughness to that, and you've got to bear with it. You see, so there's a part where the kids they have to bear with it at a certain point. And it's the same way, I think, with moral issues. I can try to eliminate this and protect this and block this and prevent this, but you know what? There's a certain point, kids, at which you have a responsibility to resist to a reasonable degree. And there are issues like that come up in our life, and that's what I think this question gets into when there are external, let's say family members, neighbors, things like that. There are just some external influences that we have to resist personally. We have to resist them. We can't eliminate them. We have to resist them personally. I'm not, just because I had kids, God didn't tell all of the utility companies and the bill collectors to leave me alone because I have kids. Nobody cares if I have kids. God didn't immediately give me, a free monthly income that just sort of pours out upon me from heaven because I chose to have children. I have to work. I'm not free all day. I'm not free to, do whatever I want every day. I have to work. I have to earn money to pay our bills, to provide for our lives. There are going to be evils that I can't prevent, and the kids have to learn that they have to resist, because ultimately the duty of parents is to teach our children to handle freedom responsibly. So that's another challenge, to handle freedom responsibly. So I'm sorry this talk was a long one, but I think this is a topic that's more complicated than most parents are willing to admit. And what I hoped to do in this talk is sort of direct our attention to the issues behind the video games that are the real issues, and not just video games, any kind of issue like that. Watching television, listening to music, on and on, whatever. There are issues behind these superficial issues that we need to think about, because we can't just lazily demonize the video games and keep talking about the video games and video games and video games, because they themselves are not intrinsically evil. And there are circumstances where they may be enjoyed, I think, for the good of the kids and for the good of their culture. And we could talk about that more in another talk. But I think we have to step back and ask, are we really providing our kids with the opportunities and resources that we imagine we are? Or are we asking them to do things that are simply not reasonable? And, are we the source of our own trouble? So I hope that's helpful. I intended this to be sort of a beginning of a deeper conversation about this issue, because I don't want to deal with it in a shallow way, because that's just copping out of the real challenge. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope that listening to this, it'll cause you to think about, your circumstances and things you see as problems, and hopefully you can follow up with some comments or questions to take this to the next step, to the next topic, and I'll think of those things as well, and maybe I can come up with those topics myself. But if there's anything that we've talked about here that has aroused in you questions about other issues, let me know what they are, and we'll sort of trace this. We'll trace this out and see where it leads us, and try to find a helpful solution and principles that guide us in parenting through these challenges, because they're only going to increase. It's only going to get busier. I hope that's helpful. God bless.